Hello and welcome to session 2 of the panel 3. My name is Marine Cornelis and I'm the co-panel leader along with Clemence Rhodes. We are really happy to have you here. This session, this panel in general focuses on how energy efficiency policies can be financed, designed, implemented and managed to generate optimal and lasting energy saving. And in particular, we are focusing today on warming up in a digital world. We have 4 amazing speakers and presenters who are Erin Cornelis, not related. We have Timothy Foxen of the University of Sussex, Juan Pablo Jimenez Navarro of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and Vlasios Oikonomou from the Institute for European Energy and Climate Policy. They have prepared presentations. I'm sure they will be super interesting and I'm really looking forward to hearing them. Clemence, is there something you would like to add at this moment?
I would also love to say a warm welcome to everybody who already joined, and please ask your questions in the Q&A session of WUVA. I will also have a look at the chat and at the chat in Zoom and so on, so your question will not be lost, but it'll make things easier for you, and the questions are persistent if you ask them in the Q&A session, so please go ahead and ask questions. Yesterday we were a little short on questions and I love talking, you know that, but it's better if I can ask your questions to our panelists. So please feel motivated, ask your questions and start discussions also in the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Clemence. Indeed, ask questions on the WUVA app. And Erwin Cornelis, the floor is yours. You will be presenting on to CHP or not to CHP. That's the question. Love the title.
To CHP or not to CHP? That is the question I'd like to address here in my presentation. Good morning, I am Erwin Cornelis and I would like to discuss with you whether thermal power plants should supply heat next to electricity. Allow me to depict the context first. Belgium is phasing out its nuclear power, and in the coming years 7 reactors at 2 sites with a combined capacity of 5.9 gigawatt will be shut down. They now supply up to half of the electricity in Belgium. Energy companies are now submitting permits for new power plants, and the map here indicates which projects they have in mind. And the preferred concept is a gas-fueled combined cycle with a high capacity, about 900 megawatt, and a high electrical efficiency up to 63%. However, they do not include heat supply in the concept, and that is what I would like to discuss here. So, the research question of my presentation is, to what extent heat should be recycled from these thermal power plants? I first challenge the need for thermal power plants in Belgium. Second, I estimate the potential supply of heat. Third, I discuss how to integrate the electricity and the heat sector. I do this using recent and detailed electricity system scenario results. I also do this using actual demand and production profiles with a high temporal resolution. Let's first have a look to the results of the Belgian long-term electricity system scenarios which have been developed by the Belgian Research Institute Energyville. These results indicate that Belgium still will need thermal power capacity in the long term, and that depends on how much renewable energy there will be in future. And dependent on the penetration of renewable energy, Belgium would need 3.6 to 5 gigawatt of thermal power capacity compared to 6.4 gigawatt today. The load of those thermal plants, however, would significantly drop to about half of the load of today. If I combine these numbers with efficiencies proven in practice, the potential heat supply is estimated at 4 to 6 terawatt-hour by 2045. To put this into practice, I compare this potential heat supply with the heat demand for space heating, and I arrive at a figure of about 50 terawatt-hour. I found a figure for Flanders, which is about half of the country. So the potential heat supply is actually a fraction of the heat demand for space heating. If we also compare the potential heat supply by thermal power plants by the potential supply of other renewable heat sources, we also do see that it's actually a fraction, and also here only figures for Flanders are presented. But if power plants were to supply heat next to electricity, there are certain considerations to take into account. First of all, the electrical efficiency will decrease, and that needs to be compensated with additional power production. Secondly, to decarbonize the energy supply by those thermal power plants, both electricity and heat, that requires the supply of decarbonized fuels to these power plants. And actually this means the supply of green hydrogen. But in the production chain of green hydrogen to fuel those thermal power plants, there are significant conversion losses, and these conversion losses are actually significantly higher than the potential heat supply by those thermal power plants, and this is something that needs to be looked at. But now, let's confront this annual data with production and consumption profiles with a high temporal resolution. And what you do see here is the profile of the electricity demand for Belgium for the year 2016, and also the production of electricity by sun and wind also for Belgium for the year 2016. Let's move to the potential situation in 2045. The electricity consumption will increase because of the electrification of transport and also because of the massive rollout of heat pumps. There will be also more photovoltaic panels and wind turbines. The 2016 profiles of sun and wind production are amplified here using the results of the Belgian long-term electricity scenarios of Energieville. What we do observe here is that there are periods in which the renewable electricity production is far below the demand for electricity. And these periods also last for days in a row, especially in autumn and winter. Demand response and storage can help balancing the grid, but it's very unlikely that they will be able to cover such long-lasting gaps. Belgium could import electricity from its neighboring countries, but it is actually likely that these neighboring countries will face similar balancing problems, and that limits the capacity to supply us with electricity. So, to cover the gaps, we actually need the production of electricity by thermal power plants. And the extent of those gaps, up to 14 gigawatt, indicate a potential larger need for such thermal power plants than concluded by the Belgian long-term electricity system scenarios by Energieville. But if we think about integrating the electricity and the heat sector, we also should look at the demand for heat, the profile for heat demand. And here you see the profiles for 2016. Let's move to the potential situation in 2045. The electricity consumption has gone up, as discussed before. In contrast, the heat demand will decrease as a result of energy efficiency investments. We also can see here that the heat demand appears inversely related to the renewable electricity production. And so actually they can compensate each other. This supports the integration of the heat and power sector. However, to realize the sector integration, that requires the deployment of district heating grids, and there are limits to this. Only about 1/3 of the heat demand is dense enough to motivate investments in district heating in these areas. So this indicates that the potential supply of heat from power plants is higher than the potential demand. Now I arrive now at my final slides. Some studies indicate that Belgium still will need thermal power capacity in future, and my analysis confirms this. Moreover, my analysis indicates that the need by the studies might be underestimated. This will require the supply of decarbonized fuels, but the associated conversion losses are significantly higher than the potential heat supply, and this is something that needs to be optimized. It makes sense to integrate the electricity and the heat sectors, as the heat demand appears inversely related to the renewable electricity production. However, the heat supply potential is limited by the potential to deploy district heating grids connecting supply to demand. So let's go back to my research question here. To what extent should heat be recycled from the thermal power plants that are planned by those energy companies? And the answer is, well, not necessarily, as the need for electricity from those plants it might be higher than the need for heat from those plants. Moreover, it would require the deployment of district heating grids in a large area to absorb the heat from the thermal power plants with such a high capacity. However, as the integration of electricity and heat sector seems to make sense, it is recommended to have a multitude of smaller capacity CHPs next to the handful of large power plants. And this is what at least 8 cities in Belgium aim to do by 2050. And let me end with a final note on the method. I validated scenario results using actual profiles with a high temporal resolution, and this is actually what we need to look at if we really want to well understand the relation between the weather conditions and the energy system. The share of renewable energy is increasing in our energy system, so is the impact of the weather conditions on the way we consume and produce. I thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Alvin, for that very interesting presentation. I think especially all the questions around CHP are already very much in discussion and will become more important in the future, and they are highly controversial at some points. I know the discussion which is going on in Germany. We have questions in the chat, and I will start with a question by Stefan Thomas, and he is asking why electricity demand in Belgium at night or on weekends is only 15% lower than during peak times. So there's no in the graph you showed there was obviously no significant day-night difference. And could Belgium save energy in temporarily unoccupied buildings, unused production plants, and so on? So is there any potential in that respect? And this is a bit followed by the second question we have in the chat by Marian Santini, where the question is whether there is an increased potential for demand flexibility considered in your considerations.
Thank you for these interesting questions. I'm coming through correctly.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just to check that. Well, what you have seen are daily figures. So I could have shown hourly data, but then to show it in a graph, then it would be a bit messy. So what you saw in the graph are daily figures. And so what you did see in the graph was the difference between weekends and working days. And we have a lot of energy intensive industry, which creates a heavy base load of consumption compared to other countries like, for instance, Ireland or UK, where you have a bigger difference between off peaks and peak hours, and also between the weekends and the working days. And there was a second question by Stefan.
Yeah, and it was a bit, so the question was, how could Belgium save energy in temporarily unoccupied buildings, unused production plants? I assume especially over the weekends. And this is a bit followed then by the follow-up question by Marian on the demand flexibility potential, which you see in Belgium.
The demand flexibility, let's start with this. It was a bit hard to assess what it will have a contribution, of course, and actually the move from hourly day figures by hour, also quarter by quarter, the step from there to 1 day already assumes to some extent the use of demand response, because then you carry over the excess production during daytime over to the nighttime. But still, if you look to the graphs, there are days in a row where production is lower than the demand, but there are also days in a row where the production is higher than the demand. So in the long-term scenarios produced by Energyville, they estimate the potential of storage capacity to 13 gigawatts, which is comparable to the generation capacity uh, by uh, by renewables, I think. But those, I did some estimation, and that capacity would be filled in summertime within a couple of hours, and then it's already at the limits of what it can do. So you really need, if you just would like to go purely electricity with only electricity, and in a scenario with only electricity, then you need quite a lot of demand response and also of storage capacity. And I also think that there are limits to demand response. You can ask the consumers to postpone consumption for a couple of hours, perhaps for a day, but at some point it starts influencing the comfort of the consumer too much, and then there are limits, and then they consume electricity anyhow, because, well, you can ask them to wait one day with the laundry, um, but at some point the laundry must be done, just to give an example.
Yeah, thank you very much. And there is another question regarding the current share of district heating in Belgium, which is, I think, important if you think of the huge potential here. So can you elaborate on that a bit?
It is very well developed, but off-site, not connected to district heatings, because, well, we do not have a tradition in district heating, although there is a momentum that has developed about a decade ago in the northern part of the country in Flanders, and every city over there is now considering the development of district heating. But, well, aside from that, we have decades of development of CHP, especially also in the north of the country. And CHP in Flanders, the northern part, is delivering 20% of the electricity. So it is substantial. And it is mainly connected to the energy intensive industry, so with gas turbines and also greenhouses. All greenhouses have converted to CHP.
I would have a follow-up question on that. If you say we will see a massive increase in the thermal energy generation from CHP in your 2045 scenario, there were still a couple of days when there was neither a real need for backup power, nor so we had a gap of heat generation, more or less, where your CHP power could not satisfy the whole need for power. So did you somehow foresee the need for backup capacities also for the heat generation in your considerations? Because depending on the process you want to supply, you will need a stable heat supply also, equal to the stable electricity supply.
Yeah, well, indeed, I think that when designing CHP, then you also need to look for a optimum. Mm-hmm. And I do not think that the CHP will deliver all heat, because it doesn't make sense to install large thermal capacity of CHP that only will be used for a couple of hours. So there will be some optimization. And next to the CHP, then, well, other ways of generating heat will be used. And in periods also in wintertime, for instance, in which there was a lot of wind energy, this can give input to renewable electricity, which is converted using heat pumps to generate heat. And also heat storage also plays a role over here. Well, I also looked at figures for the whole of the country, which is, of course, different to looking to a specific district heating system and a specific city. And then the boundary conditions are different then. But anyhow, so next to the CHP, I believe that there is also a need for other devices providing heat, if possible, by renewable electricity, when there is an excess of renewable electricity, and also with a thermal storage capacity. Well, it is easier to store heat than to store electricity, also for a longer period and also in larger quantities.
All right, thank you, Arvin. We're perfectly well in time right now. We had a good chance to answer the questions which came from the audience, and I encourage you to continue asking questions as you did for the next presentations. Also, if you have other questions to Arvin, we will be able to answer them afterwards, and we can answer in Hoover directly in text. So keep asking your questions, comment, start discussions about the topic. I can only encourage you to do that. And I will hand back to Marine for the introduction of the next speaker. Thank you, Arvin, again for your presentation and your answers.
Thank you so much, Erwin, for this interesting presentation. Thank you, Clémence, for those amazing questions. And now I will pass the floor to Timothy Foxen, and he will be talking about the role of digitalization in low carbon scenarios. Timothy, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Foxen from the SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. And this is a presentation with my colleague, Noam Bergman, on the role of digitalization in low carbon scenarios. This work is part of the Digital Society team of the UK Centre for Research on Energy Demand Solutions, CREDS. This work is part of a project on the future impacts, looking at how the adoption of information and communications technologies, ICTs, could affect energy demand as part of the transition to a net zero carbon economy. So we investigate the potential contribution of new digital technologies and related business models for reducing energy demand in the UK, whilst delivering end-use services and creating value for users. So there are two major global transitions possibly already underway. The transition to a low-carbon society, which many of us within the energy efficiency community are deeply concerned with, and the transition to a highly digitalized society, the so-called digital revolution. And we're interested in the extent and the interaction between these two transitions. And particularly work we've done so far emphasizes that the rise of information and communication technologies does not automatically lead to reduction in energy demand. It could stimulate new energy using practices or wider economic growth. So in this work, we look at future scenarios which consider these two transitions and ask what role is digitalization expected to play in a low carbon transition? And what assumptions and framings do these climate-focused transition scenarios have? We do this by investigating a number of low-carbon transition scenarios, including more qualitative projections and more quantitative models. And we identify the framings and assumptions underlying different studies, and if and how they relate the low-carbon transition to the digital revolution. In this paper, we focus on interpretive positioning of each study along 4 economic and technological axes to demonstrate a way of comparing and contrasting different scenarios. We analyze the framing of scenarios by interpreting their place along 4 different axes in relation to their relative focus on, firstly, either on decarbonizing energy supply or on managing energy demand. Secondly, whether they focus on a green growth narrative or a focus on well-being and degrowth scenarios. Thirdly, whether they assume that the business models related to digital technologies are led by large ICT firms representing the status quo, or whether they assume that there will be alternative business models which empower communities and users. And fourthly, whether these scenarios assume that digital technologies lead to greater automation for optimizing energy supply and demand, or emphasize greater agency in terms of empowering users to understand and control their energy use. So for this initial work, we've chosen 7 different prominent papers reports that offer net zero or low carbon scenarios. For UK-based projections, firstly from the Committee on Climate Change, the government's, UK government's official advisors. Secondly, from the Royal Society, the august scientific body. Thirdly, from the National Grid, the company that runs the UK National Electricity Transmission Network. And fourthly, from the Centre for Alternative Technology, a think tank that emphasises more radical alternatives and alternative technologies. And three global projections. The Smarter 2030 scenarios are by an industry-led coalition of large firms. The Heinrich Böll Foundation is another think tank based in Germany. And the Gruber-et-al. Scenarios are from a coalition of academics led by Arnulf Gruber from IASA in Austria. So the first axis we looked at is whether these scenarios emphasize the decarbonisation of energy supply, or the management of energy demand, or a mixture of the two. What we see is there are a range of assumptions, even within the small number of scenarios. The Gruber-et-al. Scenarios emphasize the reduction in demand for energy services. The Heinrich Böll Foundation scenarios also emphasize energy demand reduction. The Centre for Alternative Technologies and National Grid scenarios have a mixture, a balance of action on the supply side and demand side, whereas the other scenarios by the industry, Royal Society and the Committee on Climate Change put more emphasis on the decarbonisation of energy supply. In terms of perspectives on growth, we see that most of these scenarios assume a green growth narrative, that it's possible and desirable to decouple economic growth, rising economic growth from reductions in carbon emissions. But here the Heinrich Böll Foundation scenarios are a standout because they emphasize focusing on improvements to well-being, understood as a wider range of social and environmental indicators. The Centre for Alternative Technology scenarios fit somewhere in the middle, with some skepticism about economic growth, but also an inclusion of the potential for decoupling growth from emissions. Thirdly, in terms of the ownership of digital technologies in these scenarios, again, a wide range from Committee on Climate Change, Royal Society, and Smarter 2030 scenarios, which largely assume that large ICT firms will remain in a dominant position, a more business as usual assumption, whereas the Heinrich Böll and, to some extent, the Gruber-et-al. Scenario assume a greater role for public or common ownership and ideas around a digital commons where there is shared ownership and access to the digital space. In terms of the automation versus agency, again, a range of assumptions. Here, the Gruber-et-al. Scenarios stand out as having a greater role for agency of users that digital technologies enable users to have a greater agency in how they use energy, whereas the other scenarios tend to fit more in the middle with some more automation and some role for user agency. So what do these scenarios tell us? That they, in terms of supply and demand, all the scenarios incorporate both the need for supply-side action, innovation and diffusion of low-carbon technologies, and demand-side action through societal and behavioural changes. But they differ significantly in the relative importance they assign to these. Supply-side focused scenarios tend to be framed within a green growth narrative, assuming that it's possible to decouple economic growth from carbon emissions, whereas demand-side focused scenarios tend to be more sympathetic to a degrowth narrative, focusing on enabling a wider range of well-being indicators alongside rapid carbon reductions. However, the Gruber-Lewis scenario combines an emphasis on demand-side solutions with a green growth narrative. The Committee on Climate Change, as you might expect from government advisors, suggested transition, focusing in the 2020 preceding a rapid electrification of transport and heating, with relatively little role for explicitly for digital technologies. The Royal Society, on the other hand, highlights the disruptive nature of digitalisation, and that policy and investment can ensure that the expansion of ICTs can help to lead to more sustainable outcomes. The national grid suggests a greater need for societal engagement alongside policy to lead to a faster transition. On the other hand, the Heinrich Böll Foundation suggests that societal transformation and transformation in the way we organise our economies is key. In contrast, the Smarter 2030 industry-led report highlights the potential of ICTs to save energy and increase well-being, with consumer power driving change alongside policy. The Centre for Alternative Technology sits in between, with a recognition that climate impacts will galvanise support for collective action. The Gruber-Lewis scenarios see change coming more from people seeking a better quality of life and demanding better digital products and services, which can both enhance their quality of life and reduce carbon emissions. So in conclusion, we see many different visions and assumptions with different levels of interactions between the low carbon transition and the digital revolution. There are then clearly opportunities for improving policy and stimulating public debate on what constitutes an ICT engaged low carbon transition. The transition will clearly require interconnected changes in technologies, institutions, business models, and user practices. And this will require wide public consent, which requires informed public debate on these issues. We argue that this requires the further development of more integrated low carbon and ICT scenarios, explicitly including these different drivers and causation patterns, and could play an important role in this. And we will be going on to do further work in this project under CREDS to engage with a range of stakeholders in the UK to look at how we can develop more integrated low carbon and ICT scenarios and explore their desirability and feasibility for achieving a transition to a net zero carbon economy. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. It was a very exciting presentation. I also have to thank Noam Bergman, who is also with us today. Together, Noam and Timothy will answer your questions. Clemens, the floor is yours.
Yes, the audience is a bit quiet at the very moment, so we don't have questions in the chat, but this is not a problem because I love the topic and I have enough questions, but this shall not prevent the audience from asking questions. And I see Alvin has already answered also the questions which came up, so there a discussion is evolving, which is great. Digital technologies can help us to do that at the very moment, so we can have discussions while a presentation is running without disturbing the presenters, because the presenters are anyway pre-recording right now. So I would love to start with the questions, and we talk about digitalization, and this is my experience also in the discussion in Germany, but also on the European level. We very often mix the different effects. We always talk about digitalization as if it is one thing, and then you start talking to different people, and some say, okay, this is going to save us the whole climate change revolution, because with digital technologies we can save all the energy and carbon we need. So this strong enabling effect we see, for example, in the transport sector, but also in the industrial sector. And on the other hand, there is the discussion about the sort of rebound with the increase of energy use through digital technologies, where we have no idea what will happen in the upcoming years. And do you have a feeling how we can deal with that on the one hand in the scenarios, but also in the political discussion, that we always mix those two dimensions of digitalization? Because I think this is crucial and for the whole discussion.
Yes, great. Thanks very much, Clemens. And apologies if any of you, the slides were a bit blurry for some of you, but I think it was okay on the Hoover presentation. So yes, I mean, I think what we're arguing is there actually needs to be much more work actually looking at the integration and interaction between the digital transformation and the transition to net zero carbon. You know, because I think, you know, that there is clearly a lot of potential for digital technologies to help reduce energy demand, but we think that there are often quite, you know, sort of over-optimistic assumptions in many of these scenarios, and particularly the industry scenarios, about what can be achieved. And as I said, we know from the previous work that ourselves and colleagues, Steve Sorrell and colleagues have done, that the actual energy saving you get from you know, replacing physical goods and services with digital ones depends very sensitively on how those technologies are used and the patterns of user practices. So it's not automatic from the technologies will automatically lead to reductions in energy demand. But Noah might want to add some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to add one thing. I mean, the point that digitalization means different things to different people is one of the reasons we chose a few axes to see what the assumptions were. I mean, just one quick example, in the smart homes literature, there's almost a dichotomy or more of an axis, perhaps, as we presented it, that so there's some assumptions that the smart home will completely circumvent the user and do everything automatically to save lots of energy. There's another approach that suggests that it will give you lots of information and you will be, you know, a rational actor and save maximum energy from this information. And these are two quite different approaches. So that's just one example of we're trying to tease out what the different assumptions are about digitalization, not necessarily about specific appliances, but more broadly what approach and presumptions taking about users, about technologies, and so on.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. We have a question from the audience from Stefan Thomas, and he's asking whether the scenarios you analyzed differ in the results, and not really regarding digitalization, but also the boundary conditions. So growth of electricity demand, share of direct use of electricity versus power to X, and so on. And if there are differences, how do they relate to the results you presented?
No, do you want to?
There we go. Yeah, the short answer is yes. I mean, even within specific reports like the National Grid report, they have different scenarios with higher and lower end use energy demand. So if you look at the ones like the Heinrich Böll Foundation one is very much about social change. So it is very much about reducing demand for energy services in various ways, and therefore reducing it in demand for energy. Some of the ones that are more technology focused might have more of a focus on both on more decarbonized supply, but also in more digital technology managing of various sectors, which in itself reduces energy. So yes, we do see a difference, and it does connect to these ideas. And yeah, we're pretty much still close to the beginning here, so we can't give you all the details.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is a very interesting topic also to follow up, because when we follow the political discussion here, we see this ambivalence in the assessment of digital technologies, whether they save the world or they will somehow push us over the cliff and make things worse. And this is what makes this discussion really exciting, I think. And I love to see some more discussion about that. Anyway, we are at the timing wise, we are at the end of our Q&A session. We might come back if we stick to our schedule right now. We have another 10 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session, which is great. So again, the request to the audience, still ask questions in the chat. I saw Erwin still replying. Discussion is already going on. So also engage Tim and Noam in online discussions about the topic. I'd love to see that here. And I give back to Marine right now.
Thank you, Clemence, and thank you, Noam and Tim, for this amazing presentation and for the engaging discussion. Please go ahead, ask questions, tickle them too. That's the purpose of this summer study, and I'm really looking forward to the big discussion at the end. If now Juan Pablo Jimenez is short enough, and Vlasios later will be short enough too. So Juan Pablo Jimenez will make a presentation on efficient district heating and cooling. Does it promote the 2050 decarbonization goals? Juan Pablo, the floor is yours.
Good morning. My name is Juan Pablo Jimenez. I'm working for the Joint Research Center, the European Commission Science Service. Today I'm going to talk about the concept of efficient district heating and cooling and how a robust definition can contribute to the 2050 decarbonization goals. To start with, I would like to stress the importance of the concept of efficient district heating and cooling. And it lies with several provisions that we can find under the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Renewable Energy Directive. So among others, consumers are allowed to disconnect if their heat is provided from non-efficient district heating and cooling. Additionally, member states should use efficient district heating and cooling as a relevant tool in order to achieve the energy efficiency targets and the renewable targets under both directives. So for these reasons, we need to have a consistent definition that is, as I said before, is aligned with the 2050 goals. So the aim of our work, the work we are presenting here, is to provide the technical background for the recast of both directives that are about to happen this summer. Interpret and discuss the current definition of efficient district heating and cooling and then potential limitations, and then finally come up with a proposal on a definition for the long term, for the 2050 time horizon. So to start with, I introduce the current definition as defined in the EED in Article 2, and there efficient district heating and cooling systems are defined as those systems that are using at least 50% of renewable energy, 50% of waste heat, 75% of cogeneration, or 50% of a combination of such energy and heat. To make it simpler, the analysis, to make it more attractive, I'm using this ternary plot that you can see on the right hand side of the slide, where we have packed technologies under or fuels under three main categories: CHP on the left side, fossil fuels on the bottom side, which includes any kind of boiler or heating technologies that are fed by fossil fuels, and then on the right side, renewable and waste heat. So any given point in this ternary plot, it's built upon the combination of these three elements. So the dot at the center, it's district heating that is fed from CHP up to 34%, renewable 33%, and fossil fuels another 33%. In this graph, we already indicate the green area, which corresponds to those combinations that fall under the efficient district heating criteria as it is defined today. However, there are already some elements that we can see that they are missed in the current definition. For example, there are no provisions regarding how the cogenerated heat should be produced, meaning high efficiency or non-high efficiency cogeneration. The combination of the concepts energy and heat may also lead to confusion because energy can be defined in terms of final energy, of gross final energy, or even in terms of primary energy, which means the energy associated to the different fuels. So in our view, there are four main elements that require further discussions. These are the energy flows, in which terms we do the accounting for these shares. The role of thermal losses, the combination of thresholds that they may lead to different performances as they are defined today, and finally the role of CHP. So in this simplified layout, I bring a district heating network where the energy, the heat demand is provided from four different technologies. It's a dual boiler, a heat pump, a CHP, and a waste heat. So based on the current definition, we will have a renewable input from biomass, from waste heat, the 20 units of CHP that are also added to the renewable, and the 12 units of ambient heat used in the heat pump. So adding all these elements, we will have 72% of a combination of different options like renewable cogenerated heat and waste heat. So this example will fall under the category of efficient district heating and cooling. Coming back to the comment on this combination of terms, including heat and energy, we came to the conclusion that the accounting should be done in gross final energy. There are elements in the directive that point into that direction. But our comment here is that doing the accounting in primary energy terms will require further analysis on, for example, how to allocate fuels in CHP. Or, for example, a common agreement on how ambient heat should be incorporated, given the fact that it's already a heat stream. So it could be converted into primary energy by factors of 1, but it's not really a straightforward way. And at the end of the day, the heat quantities going into the network already provide a good indicator on how clean our system is. Another important element here is the role of thermal losses. Thermal losses are not considered in the definition. This may be the right approach if we consider that all supply systems provide energy from the same point in the network, so they are subject to the same losses. Or if this is not the case, we can assume that they are all affected by more or less the same amount of losses. So in the ratio of efficient to the total gross final energy, these losses will be cancelled out. But what will happen if we have a system that is providing heat way closer to city, let's say, than other which is far away, some amount of kilometers away from the supply side. So this definition will penalize those sources that are closest to the heat sinks. However, again, we consider that it's not easy to establish a method to determine the losses, so we go on with this assumption on common losses for all heat suppliers. Then, in our view, and for the really short term, the current definition of efficient district heating will require two additional provisions. First is a high efficiency for cogenerated heat, because otherwise we could be producing heat from in CHP from coal and with very low efficiency, which is completely against the energy efficiency principle and also the increase of renewable share. And the second clause that we consider relevant is to replace this term such heat and energy and replace it by thermal energy going into the network. So we avoid any interpretation on where we should account the different energy flows. So this is a definition for the short term, but moving into the third element of our discussion, the combination of threshold, we decided to move the discussion into the carbon intensity dimension. So what we present here is on the left side is the shape of the current definition of efficient district heating. But now we represent the scale in as I said, in CO2 terms. The first element we have to consider is that, as I said before, the current definition allow, for example, the combination of 40%, 49% fossil fuel CHP and 1% of renewable. That will be the dot here. So in our view, we have to close this gap. We have to close the area which does not fall under the current definition by this dotted line, because this would lead to a more robust definition in terms of CO2. If we see on the right hand side, we realize that this dotted line is pretty close to the 100 grams threshold. This number is in line with the threshold set in the European taxonomy for sustainable funding, and it's more or less aligned to what we are requesting for energy producers technologies to perform in terms of CO2 emissions. But by doing so, we will avoid any kind of strange combination of technologies that may not be so clean in the end. Last, in our discussion, we wanted to discuss about the role of CHP. We said that at least we need to impose that for CHP, the generation should be highly efficient. However, if we look in the long term, the requirements set today for high efficiency CHP, which mean primary savings of at least 10%, may not be realized because we are reaching the technical limitation of the CHP when the reference technologies are improving their efficiency. This is the electricity sector increases their efficiency, and also the reference heating technologies does the same. So in terms of primary saving, we see that for the 4 technologies considered in the Energy Efficiency Directive, none of them will provide primary savings about 10% in 2050. But if we do the same analysis in terms of CO2, they will stop providing for all technologies positive savings by 2050. So this suggests that the role of CHP in the long term provided by fossil fuels, mainly gas, should tend to reduce and ultimately disappear. Looking now into the long-term definition of efficient district heating, our proposal here is to set a definition that evolves over time. So what we propose by 2030 is to set a threshold that is a bit more ambitious than the 100 grams per CO2, which is the dotted line I presented before. While by 2040, assuming a linear decrease in carbon intensity terms, we set a threshold a bit more ambitious than the 50 grams per kilowatt hour of heat supply, which is defined by this dotted line. So if we translate these two approaches into a wording that is similar to the current definition, because we don't want to change the whole scope of the definition due to specific policy constraints, we can say that by 2030, an efficient district heating and cooling means a district heating or cooling system using always equal or more renewable energy technologies than fossil fuel individual generation energy technologies. So in 2040, following the same approach and setting more stringent criteria, a clean district heating and cooling means a district heating that it's using always 60 percentage points more renewable than fossil fuel, either from CHP or from individual heating system. And ultimately, by 2050, the clean district heating and cooling is a system that it's using exclusively a combination of renewable fuels. So in this way, we keep accommodating the definition in a progressive way towards 2050 goals. That's all from my side. I'm willing to receive your questions and I reply to them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Juan, for your very interesting presentation. I think the topic, and this is what I meant before when I had Erwin's presentation on CHP, and we can see it in the chat. The questions are becoming a bit controversial, and CHP is a controversial topic. So I would love to start start with a question of Jean-Sebastian Brock, who is asking whether it would be possible to have a definition of an efficient district heating system, including also the efficiency of the heat demand, so of the buildings which are behind, because at the moment the approach which is used is more or less taken the energy demand which is provided by the district heating grid as a given variable, so we don't care about what comes behind. And wouldn't that be an option, and would that be a way to move forward to also include the efficiency of the energy use, so of the buildings mainly behind?
Yeah, actually there is a fundamental contradiction in the definition itself, because it says efficient and then we talk about energy input shares. And this question is coming every time we talk about this. In my view, we have some policy constraints, let's say, in this work, because we cannot completely change the scope. So we're trying to push a bit into the right direction. But in my view, we will need to have two separate indicators. One is efficiency itself, that I agree should cover the whole value chain of the heat supply. And the other one is regarding which are the sources that we are using in our system. So in my personal opinion, we should build policies on this front based on these two indicators. Because as it is now, we talk about efficiency and then we refer to shares of renewable and waste and so on. And to build this indicator on on efficiency, I fully agree. We should cover the whole way, the whole heat supply or cooling supply from the generation until the end user. But from the statistical, national statistical point of view, it's easier to set a layer where you can pick the national numbers in a easier way.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. There's another comment. It's more a comment or a provocative question by Jean-Sebastien in the chat. How can district heating or cooling be considered efficient in view of carbon neutrality if it's still using fossil fuels, even if you're using fossil fuels efficiently, but it's still fossil technology? And I would have a follow-up question on that, regarding the lock-in effect. So if we, I mean, every CHP installation we install today will at least last for 15 or 20 years. So being in 2021, we're talking about the target state of 2040, 2045 for the installations. So provocatively, should we at all, at the very moment, apart from the political boundary conditions, should we at all build fossil fuel CHP for district heating, and not the case as Erwin showed it, if we have power generation and using the heat as more or less waste heat from power generation, electricity generation we need? So if you could elaborate a bit on that.
My quick answer will be no, we shouldn't from now. But it's also true that reality is what it is. We have already assets, we have already other needs, that from those needs we can build on, for example, waste heat from industry. But it's true, for example, that in Poland, for them it's really impossible to apply this approach, because they said we can shift from coal to gas, and for us it's already a great step. But it's true that if we look only into the district heating sector, we'll not be able to go to zero by 2050. And I agree to avoid lock-in effects. From today, we should invest on gas, because these investments will go in 30 years probably, or even more. But at the same time, reality is that some countries, they are phasing out, for example, nuclear or other technologies, and we need to guarantee supply. But in any case, I think from the political side, we should try to push in the right way, and then be flexible enough to understand specific realities.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answer. And I know this is not an easy topic to answer and to discuss. This would be a perfect topic for a glass of wine, probably for over lunchtime. And anyway, we are 2 or 3 minutes behind schedule, but still doing very well. So I give back to Marine and to announce our last presentation today.
Yes, please. So Vlasios, the floor will be yours, but please keep tight. You have 15 minutes. Vlasios Oikonomou will present us his research on energy efficiency first principle in regional governance. Vlasios, the floor is yours. You will be talking live.
Marine, it's a recording.
The Netherlands, and the article is about the energy efficiency first principle in the regional planning. We've seen that there are several presentations during this event on the eceee about the energy efficiency first principle, which means that it gains a lot of attention in the contemporary policy making from the EU. Now, the brief history of the energy efficiency first is that indeed it's a concept being developed from the 80s, which had to do with approaches for energy planning to take into account that acting on the demand side is very possible, likewise on the supply side. Mainly it was on the electricity sector in the US, which had integrated utilities and of course vertical monopolies. And then in the late 90s and 2000s, we have the liberalization of the energy markets, where the energy efficiency activities are taking a much more prominent role in the entire energy planning. And then from the 2010s, we see that there is already something more is needed. Demand side resources are getting more and more attention, and they're being explored more systematically with a broader perspective. Coming up finally 2018 on the governance regulation, which defines somehow the energy efficiency first. The definition from the governance regulations was that it takes into account the energy planning and in policy and investment decisions of all the alternative cost-efficient energy efficiency measures to make energy demand and supply more efficient. So in essence, we have to take into account the concept of cost effectiveness and social cost effectiveness on both the demand and supply side options, meaning also including conversion, transmission, and distribution of energy. Now from our project that we're coordinating, the Horizon 2020 NF-FIRST project, which was presented also from other colleagues these days, the definition we have come up from the various definitions, of course, in the field, is that it gives priority to demand-side resources whenever they are more cost-effective from a societal perspective than investments in energy infrastructure. This we have to keep it in mind. It's not about the one or the other option, but we always have to carry out the social cost effectiveness analysis to understand where the demand side or the supply side investments are more effective. Now, on when we say about exploring demand and supply side options, if we take into account the macro level, it means really to consider all the options in a total system cost perspective. So here you can see on the left side, the supply side resources, on the right side, the demand side resources. And on the supply side, we speak about all the types of fuels, the networks, the generators, the renewables, network storage. And on the right side, conservation, demand flexibility, energy efficiency and such. And of course, we try to minimize the system costs when we put them all in a basket. And in order to make the decision more transparent, we have to take into account, and we must take into account in the calculation, the multiple benefits from energy efficiency. And as we said, this is in essence the practice that we have to prioritize the demand side resources whenever they are more cost effective from a societal perspective. And this decision principle must be applied systematically on all energy related investments. Now, just keep in mind these keywords. The first one is the prioritizing. Then end use efficiency and demand response. We speak about all the demand response options, not only about the private cost, but also the social costs benefit, and including the multiple impacts in the long run. The idea why we do it is, first of all, to understand the objectives that we have, the time frame and the impacts that we'll be taking into account. Systematically means this principle has to be embedded in the core, in the heart of the energy policy making, and the equal opportunities has to be a fair basis of comparison. So there has to be a level playing field without biases. Now, as you can see, that energy efficiency first has been applied mainly on the national level and is being considered at this stage mainly on the national levels. Some national energy and climate policy plans have embedded it or have, let's say, mentioned it to some extent without, of course, concrete measures, very rare, scarce concrete measures, while we see that this element is not being taken at all into account in the regional development, in the regional governance. And the regional development plans, actually, the point that these are being embedded into multi-level governance schemes from the national to local. The regional plans influence the implementation of the national NECPs, and they are not, and so the eceee is not really taken into account. Then we see that there is a big potential because energy efficiency first can be integrated in the multiple agendas that regional governments do face. And from the multiple agendas, we mean about the cohesion funds, the ERDFs, the regional plans, the social fund plus, the multi-annual finance frameworks, just transition funds. So all this money that will flow into the regions, they should be somehow being integrating the energy efficiency first principle. And then the regions can aim at the regional energy planning, and this is driven by, they want to ensure the security of supply for the local industries, the companies and their population, and to promote local energy generation that is perceived as good providers of the local jobs and local tax revenue. So this is the main motivation from the regions, and that's where we consider that energy efficiency first could play a role in the energy planning. So not just about the supply side, but also about the demand side. Here we have carried out an analysis in 4 regions. You can see on how this principle can be embedded. And we see that, taking into examples from Croatia or Ireland here, for instance, that we have in Ireland, there was in the southeast Ireland, there is a great infrastructure and the suppliers work at the national level. So there was no segregation by region or county, while the energy related competencies were regulated at the national level with all the laws and bylaws from Croatia. And therefore, these are the implementing bodies. You can see there is departments of energy and climate, or likewise ministry. And the regional plans in Croatia, for instance, are being continuously developing, feeding in the annual energy efficiency plans. While in Ireland, there is the Energy Transition 2030, developed by the 3CA and the municipalities. And likewise, the success factors in both countries was about, it's very much linked to the national level policies. In Croatia and Ireland, there is funding and the carbon taxation for behavioral change, while on the barrier side, there are the supply chain barriers, there are political barriers, lack of expertise or knowledge, which is quite common in all the activities of the energy efficiency first. And likewise, you can see that in other countries, in Italy or Spain, we do face more or less similar issues. Of course, in the countries that there is a region, the coal regions in transition, the significance of energy efficiency first can be much higher. Nevertheless, we are fully aware that at this stage, neither in the coal transition plans nor in the ERD, in the recovery and resilience plans, first is a predominant factor in deciding whether the investments are eligible or not. Now, what the planning process should look like. Primarily, we see that in order to set up the scene for energy efficiency first, it's important to discuss the development planning of the roadmaps, to decide, to understand the problem, understand the needs and the barriers. Then the next step is to set the alternatives, so all the various investment options, carry out the social cost benefit analysis, collect the data for all the alternatives and provide inputs for a decision support structure, implement the analysis through multiple tools, decision support tools, whatever, and then carry out deliberation with stakeholders in order to co-develop the plan. You know, one of the issues that we've seen everywhere is that all these type of plans, if they're not really co-developed, or the citizens do not have a big role on that, they gain very low social public acceptance, and therefore we come up again to gaps and investment gaps. And that's where we see in the policy frameworks. You can see in the scheme on the bottom right, we have all the various policy frameworks, climate, energy efficiency. Regions must compare the demand and supply options and monitor the policy frameworks up to this planning phase. Now, it's very important actually to consider also that planning is not just a desk research activity. It has to be very much embedded with the stakeholder works. And it means that stakeholders must be engaged from the scratch for both co-creating and engaging. And finally, it's important to identify and quantify, as we said, all the possible options. And here you can have a look more or less on what type of stakeholders do play a role in the entire decision process. As you can see from the national level, we have the regulatory bodies, which are in essence undertaking the DSO and TSO remuneration. They have the tariffs, they have the market design, and on the planning phase, they can develop a conscious demand CBA methodology or a social benefit rates, approve the network investments, or check against whether all these plans are supporting or are coinciding with the national and EU plans. And on the monitoring phase, they can have the compliance check and the reviews of the reporting. Likewise, on the electricity producers, where they have the forecasts, they can assess the alternatives, they carry out, of course, the investments, and they actually also carry out the internal monitoring. So likewise with the TSOs. And then for the regional local authorities, they, on the implementation level, they actually set the local energy use targets and the policies as they are being requested to report based on their regional plans and regional development plans. And on the planning phase, they can harmonize the network development with spatial planning, also the housing stock changes, and also all the investment they plan to undertake in the coming period. They approve the construction of the power plants or the grid expansion, whatever, on based on their jurisdictions, geographical jurisdictions, and they can demand for network developments, upgrading the network. So it's them, the ones that will be the pushing factor for setting up the scene for investments or not on supply and demand side infrastructure. And then they are, of course, responsible for the monitoring and verification activities. Now, if we take into account the planning steps in the 4 regions we mentioned, we can see that the first one, for instance, in Spain, it would be the deliberation with the stakeholders. There would be multi-stakeholder committees. That's the first plan they would consider. Then development of the plan, final draft, and then approvals and up to the implementation. In Croatia, from the other colleagues, we saw that the regions issue a public procurement to hire experts. Then external experts are hired. They analyze energy production and consumption. Regional plans are financed by open calls and up to the implementation and the MRV. Then in Ireland, the NECP, based on the NECP, municipalities prepare their own climate plans, county development plans, and then the regional plan is being created. So you can see quite different geographical jurisdictions and quite different planning steps, although all following more or less the same logic, but they have to do a lot with the country and how the procedures take place. Now, based on the 4 different elements we saw, we considered so that the role of the regional governments for the energy efficiency first is to coordinate, first of all, the regional efforts and actually enable the parties in the regions to achieve more than they would on their own. Somehow to overcome the political pressures and the clashes and understand how they first and explain actually how this procedure could be embedded in the regional structure. Then, as we said, it has to be aligned with the regional characteristics. We know that the Commission is publishing now a report on some guidance for how the A-First can be implemented on the national level. When, of course, it comes to the regional level, indeed, we have to take into account the regional characteristics and the decision-making processes already incumbent and embodied and embedded in the regional planning. Then, an important policy aspect is the regional support schemes, like the grant schemes for the renovation of buildings, training programs for professionals, etc. These defined goals which are relevant for the least cost resource mix. As we saw in the beginning, the least cost resource mix is one of the predominant factors on the energy efficiency first principle, but we do acknowledge that regions do not think about it to some extent, to a great extent. Then it's very important to co-create, as we said, with the regional stakeholders in all the phases of the decision making, the plan that will embed the first principle. So co-creation means that citizens should be asked about whether they are willing to undertake investments on the demand side, explain what the costs would be in a transparent way, what the benefits will be and the multiple benefits, and likewise when it goes to the supply side, the same aspects should be considered. And finally, is that the energy efficiency first will be embedded in the EU framework soon, as it seems. Still, there is a lot of guidance, as we said, and there is a lot of discussion, but we don't really have it as a mandatory, in a way, really mandatory aspect in the current planning phase and for the fund acquisition. So this means that the decisions of now from the region should take that into account, that maybe now it's not an obligation, or it's not really a clear obligation, but it will come. So for grid expansion, the fossil gases and heating and all those aspects, the region should consider that, okay, they would need to demonstrate to some extent why they have undertaken or not the demand side versus supply side infrastructure decisions and what were the criteria they have based it. Thank you very much for your time, and we hope that it has been interesting, and you're welcome to all remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vlasis. Clemens, do you have any questions for Vlasis?
Yeah, thank you very much, Vlasis. Again, the audience is super active, but on the previous topics, especially the CHP questions are running high. But this is also, and I would love to follow up on that with you, Vlasis, and would love to elaborate, to have you elaborate a bit on the question of integrated planning. And you mentioned the EE first principle is sometimes not really considered by the local actors, and this could be because we still have this strong distinction of the two worlds of energy supply and energy demand, and also the municipalities see themselves more in a position to somehow, yeah, provide infrastructure and not so much as an integrated energy planner. So do you see any potential how to overcome this, because this might be one of the major barriers that we're still looking at that in that respect?
Yeah, very good question, and that's indeed one of the core of the problem, that we cannot really force at this stage regions and municipalities to implement something when they are not obliged to do. And by saying obliged, we have the following concepts. First of all, you know that regions, especially in the cold transition, they have applied for the just transition mechanisms. Also, municipalities work under the covenant of mayors, and they request and seek several types of funding streams from EU bodies, EU city facility, etc., etc. But in essence, in none of all these funding instruments, we don't really have any kind of commitment or obligation towards the energy efficiency first. They are all indeed based on the supply side or on the demand side, completely separately and fragmented. This is one of the issues, so perhaps a legislative push could be there playing this role. Then I would say that one means of for the municipalities and regions that they should undertake the energy efficiency investments a bit more seriously and somehow then implement also the first principle is when they speak about the poverty aspects. As you know, one of the plans, one of the key issues of the municipalities that they try to tackle now energy poverty parts. And by doing that, they always speak about refurbishment of lower buildings. And that, to this extent, perhaps could be one idea where they should prioritize the demand versus supply side investments, or at least check it from a social cost perspective. And when we speak about income issues and social aspects and poverty, for sure that I would bet that the demand side aspects would be much socially cost effective than the supply side aspects. So one, just to highlight in this question is that indeed we don't have laws obliging anybody doing it yet. Okay, that's clear, especially in the regions. But if the regions want to consider all the other aspects that they have in their development agendas, and this means eradication of poverty, upgrading their building stock, etc., perhaps these aspects could be one means of setting the scene for the first implementation until the laws from the Commission come and oblige regions and cities at some extent to do it. You know, perhaps an issue of timing also, that we did have the recovery and resilience plans, we did have the just transition that came up, member states submitted it, and there was no law obliging them to undertake the first at this stage. So perhaps a timing, but this of course can be remedied in the future.
Yeah, John Sebastian, the chat is just underlining the importance of regions in the use of EU funding, and that the energy efficiency first principle, of course, could be included better, and this is a huge opportunity. I would have a follow-up question. If we think about countries having an obligation scheme, an energy efficiency obligation scheme, do you see a difference in the implementation of the first principle? Because you could assume that if the utilities themselves have a motivation to be more active on the demand side, that would help here. So is there a different approach to the first if you have an obligation scheme in place?
Yeah, that's one of the means also of addressing that. You know, the first concept actually is a concept as such, and it's a mindset. It means that we have to think differently and start prioritizing investments. I would say with the implementation of an obligation scheme where we have utilities carrying out savings wherever they want to any end use, could be even public buildings, could be private buildings, and by having regional plans guiding them and helping them and steering the investments towards the demand side options, of course, this could work. And I would say that keep it simple, that if regions would have this type of ideas and this type of concept that, yes, indeed, we want to invest also in the demand side options because of these reasons of the first, and for all our regional plans and social aspects, then, of course, the utilities would be more keen in working together with the regions and investing on the demand side options. And that's what I say, it's important to have legislation, first of all, in place and clear explanation to the regions why this part is important. I have the feeling that at this stage, and what we explored with Wolfgang, and from that we wrote together the paper, is that indeed regions are completely out of the mindset. That's why only very few regions in Europe and regional governments, I think, they have at least understood or are in the process of understanding what this principle is and how it would affect them.
A bit of a follow-up to what I asked is now also in the Q&A session by Caroline Damgaard. potential role of network companies in emerging from more or less an infrastructure provider to become a distribution system operator, so integrating demand and supply side. Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, of course, for the network companies, they could be also one of the key players. As you saw in the parts on the slide, we've had the network companies also there under the DSOs. Of course, they are one of the key partners that will, in essence, play the intermediate role of setting up the SIM for the first. We have to check though, as a network company is also linked to the decision of the region, and that's why I keep on saying about regions, because the paper is in regions. So from the point that they are also somehow linked to the decisions of the region, because regions approve spatial planning parts and approve where everything should be built. I would say that if there is a good cooperation, a clear guidance, indeed, network companies will better regulate themselves for where to set the scene on the demand or the supply side options. So both type of, the regions will play an important role because they have the space, actually, they have the geographical space under them and the land where everything will be built. So all the approvals come from them. So if somehow they better understand what this is, why first is important for them and what they can benefit actually out of it, that they can cover multiple targets with first principle, then for sure all the other market parties, utilities, TSOs, networks, and even to consumers in the end, they can better position themselves and implement investments on the demand versus supply side.
Yeah, thank you, Vlasis, for also that, again, very comprehensive answer. We would have another couple of minutes if there are still questions from the audience to the group. A comment from Erwin now, but Erwin, you can say it yourself. Just switch your camera on because you're here, and all the other speakers can have their cameras on right now too, if they like. Erwin, you can just ask your question or give your comment yourself if you like.
Well, it was more a comment than a question, just to give some more insights in the situation of Flanders, which is the northern part, which is actually very dynamic. And what we do see is that there's a lot of dimension coming from the main cities, which I'm thinking the next step. And aside that, so there is almost all municipalities have signed the Covenant of Mayors. They are grouped in regions, so intermunicipal organizations, and they collaborate on several aspects, on the distribution of energy, and also collaboration with waste collection and things like that. And also within those organizations, they support each other in drafting local action plans and decarbonization. And the main cities who take the lead over there, and also the organization for the cities and municipalities organized at the Flemish level is also very active and very supportive over there. So that's what I do see here. And it's very bottom up, I would say, just to add to your presentation.
Clemence, you're muted.
I just thanked Erwin for his contribution. So, are there any other additions from our panelists on that? I mean, Juan, what your work and your presentation was much closer connected to what we discussed, but I think in a wider context, we will see how also digitalization can contribute to the implementation of the NF-first principle, and I see that as a very close link, because it's a huge enabler of really understanding and driving the demand side. Perhaps Tim, you can give us a short idea whether, especially this NF-first idea is a part in the current discussions around digitalization right now, and whether you see it also in your scenarios in that context.
Yeah, I fully agree, and it's an issue that we find when we try to provide guidance on how to measure at the national level. We face with the problem that member states, they are not against, but they're not super happy, because they said, oh, it's impossible that we can collect this information. So we have to come up with something that is simple, but it's not showing the full picture. So ideally, if we had a full digitalized energy system, we will have a better understanding on how we are performing in terms of goals and efficiencies and so on. So yeah, I fully agree to that, that it's essential to improve energy statistics, of course.
And Noam and Tim, do you want to add on that too?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on it. I mean, unfortunately, in the UK, the energy efficiency first principle has not got much traction, but there is an increasing focus on at the local level, and particularly the role of the local municipal authorities in the UK, who historically haven't had a big role in energy provision, but are now having a much bigger role, and many of them have committed to the climate emergency and carbon reduction targets, and so there's great potential, we think, for pursuing a greater role for energy demand reduction, including through ICTs. So we will be looking at that as well in some of our work.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have to hand over, the church bells are ringing. It's noon here. So I have to hand over to Marine for the final words.
Yes, actually, Timothy's last words were a perfect transition for tomorrow's panel 3 session, which will be on local action and users driving the change. It's about all of us. So let's meet tomorrow at 10:30 with myself and Clémence and amazing speakers. And we also have informal sessions, so please go ahead and just look at them. And I know that Erwin wanted to say a couple of things about digitalization, so it will be the moment. So the 2 sessions we will have, one is led by Paolo Bertoldi from the Urban Commission, and we will be looking at the impact of energy efficiency projects on property values, rents, and credit risks. And the other one will be led by Cedric Jenere from SIG. It will discuss a concept for a pan-European interactive knowledge transfer platform for radical energy savings. It sounds super exciting. Both will take place at 4:15 CST and will be in Zoom meeting, so everyone can join the discussion. So please join, and otherwise see you on the platform, and see you tomorrow. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.